Welcome everyone to our first Innovators Toolkit of the semester. So glad that you are tuning in for our first event after our kickoff. And today our first guest is Troy Wiipongwii. He is the founder of the William Mary Blockchain Lab as well as Max Collab LLC. He graduated in 2018 with his master's in public policy and statistics from William & Mary. And today he's here to talk to us about blockchain and give us a little run through on what it can do for us.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to just go through for about 20 to 30 minutes with a high level overview of blockchain and specifically go through kind of like a history of how I was introduced to it and also how it's kind of evolved over the past decade. And look at it kind of from the lens of an entrepreneurial perspective at each level or each layer. And end off with a few things that our viewers can look at afterwards, as well as tools that they could possibly use to get involved in the blockchain space. That I will share you give me sharing ability.
Oh yeah, of course. Should be good.
Can you see?
Yep, perfect.
Awesome. So here's a brief table of contents. I want to start off with a brief introduction to Bitcoin, kind of introduce some of the limitations of Bitcoin and ultimately why Ethereum evolved, what came out of Ethereum, which were ICOs and Dapps, go into talking about a decision tree for whether or not people would need a blockchain, and finish off again with some of the tools that can be used. With that, Bitcoin is a pure peer-to-peer electronic cash platform. It uses a bunch of different technologies like cryptography, timestamps, digital signatures, and consensus mechanisms, specifically proof of work. I will not define that right now. There are some good reading materials at the bottom. And these combination of technologies allow us to remove a third party from financial services. And what that means is if you want to send money to friends and family, either domestically or abroad, you typically go through a bank, go through PayPal, go through Western Union. With the combination of these technologies, we can remove that need for that third party, making the transactions faster, cheaper in a lot of cases. One of the biggest benefits of Bitcoin is that it is borderless, that the transaction system itself is a bit more secure than using a PayPal or Bank of America. If you're talking about a secure platform, there are other technologies around it. We have like exchanges, like Coinbase or a Bitcoin exchange that can add some security risk itself, but if you're talking about just the platform, it is far superior in terms of technology security. And the last benefit is a transparent monetary policy. So if we're talking about like inflation and deflation and whether or not a financial system could be manipulated by a government or large banking institutions, you don't really have that in Bitcoin. There's a fixed supply of currency, which makes it deflationary. And the idea was to recreate gold property within this currency to give it that non-inflationary tool. And for entrepreneurs, pre-Ethereum, pre-everything else, Bitcoin could be used to increase additional revenue sources. There are people that are holding cryptocurrency that want to use it. And the entrepreneurs themselves or store owners, small business owners that were collecting Bitcoin, if they themselves wanted to hold it, could have an appreciation of value for those coins as well. So there was a utility for it even pre what people like to call blockchain 2.0. And of course, if you're someone living in a developing nation who doesn't have access to a traditional banking system, and you're not necessarily a part of the traditional supply chain, but want to increase your exposure throughout your country or abroad, using a tool like Bitcoin also gives you that type of exposure as well. So Bitcoin's great, fantastic. We created a decentralized financial system, but it supports not so intricate or complex business logic, which is necessary to build, I hate to be redundant, but more complex systems. So what can we do beyond just transacting money? Well, for Ethereum developers, there's this future where everything could be decentralized. Everything that needs and should be decentralized could be decentralized, like the sharing economy. So you have a car that you don't want sitting in your driveway, and it's a smart car, or it's connected to some IoT sensor. You can create a contract essentially where you can share that with someone without going through the car equivalent of an Airbnb. You want to use your house as a rental property. You can use these smart contracts in the Ethereum platform to utilize that and leverage that to create revenue for yourself as well. So from the perspective of Ethereum, like this blockchain 2.0, you're opening a floodgate of opportunity for entrepreneurs to engage, even if not in the traditional sense and more in the sharing economy sense, to create new revenue for yourself. And that was a big opportunity where a lot of people started to come into the blockchain space when Ethereum popped up and exposing people to these opportunities. And one of the biggest successes for Ethereum's smart contract was something called the ICOs. And what ICOs are, they're an alternative funding mechanism for entrepreneurs. So instead of going through a bank for a loan or going to a venture capitalist or an angel investor, ICOs legitimately gave entrepreneurs the opportunity to crowdfund, but put an incentive on that crowdfunding to raise almost unrealistic amounts of money compared to 5 to 10 years ago. And this was great for a lot of new tech startups that wanted a way of raising money. They thought they had a compelling business proposition and didn't necessarily want to go for the traditional VC route. Because one, they either believed in this whole decentralized movement, or two, they couldn't raise traditional VC because their project was social impact or just wasn't good. And a few of the challenges that popped up through ICOs were they didn't necessarily square with existing law. The blockchain community quickly started to try to figure out whether or not something was a utility token, which is basically you're holding a coin that could be used to access a service, whether it was a security token, so it actually was similar to holding a stock in a company, or whether it was a pure cryptocurrency like a Bitcoin or a Litecoin. We started to create these frameworks to try to determine whether or not an ICO or a project fell into potentially SEC world. And the second challenge was honestly poor business fundamentals. You have projects that were raising $25, $30 million on a white paper. Not a complete business plan, not a prototype. They just distribute coins and said, hey, this is a project that we want to work on. We think it's going to be fantastic. And in the blockchain space, the way the coins or the tokens work through ICOs is something called tokenomics, where people are trying to decide what the appropriate incentives are for utilizing a platform and how you can ultimately generate growth within like the price of that coin and ultimately revenue for the project. So more use means more velocity of the token, which means better prices. And that ultimately failed the vast majority of the time. We are watching ICO former ICOs that have raised millions of dollars disappear daily. But there were a few promising ones, like an IPFS. If you've ever heard of BitTorrent or you've ever downloaded music online using a BitTorrent, you're probably familiar with this idea of a decentralized distributed file system. IPFS was one of those projects that raised money this way through their coin called FileCoin. And a lot of the projects for ICOs were something called decentralized apps, short dApps. And in order to understand what dApps are, they're actually not complicated at all. It's kind of important to look at the traditional web application design. So the traditional web application uses HTML, CSS, JavaScript to create pages. And there's typically an API that connects the web pages to a database in the background or a server. So that link front end, which are the web pages, API connecting to the database. A dApp is similar in a lot of ways, but the replacement is, instead of using a traditional database, you're going to use a blockchain or a decentralized file system like an IPFS, and you're going to use a smart contract, going back to that smart contract, which is the intricate business logic to accomplish certain things within these platforms, is what's connecting the blockchain and the front end. So the real kind of revolution here for blockchain and smart contracts and a traditional app ecosystem is that you have a Facebook, they own your data because it's sitting in their database. You have an Airbnb that you're using as a centralized exchange that's taking funds off the top for you as a consumer and you as a host, and also hosting that data about you as well. And you're saying, hey, we don't need these central institutions, just like we don't need a central banking institution for Bitcoin to operate these platforms. We can create an equivalent of a Facebook, an equivalent of an Airbnb, an equivalent of an Instagram using dApps with these smart contracts and the blockchain in the background. And that's huge, or potentially huge, because now you have to think of different ways of generating revenue for entrepreneurs that are creating these platforms, as well as obviously opening up different revenue streams for the people that are using the platform. And the one of the biggest things about having a blockchain smart contract backend versus a database is the censorship resistance. And one of the projects that I think is super important is from one of our William & Mary Blockchain Advisory Board teams, Annie Brown. She's running a project called Lips. What Annie noticed was that there are a lot of content creators that are LGBTQ, that are women whose intellectual property are being stolen, or they're being censored if they're using platforms like Tumblr and Instagram. If you're using a blockchain platform, you're providing revenue streams for them, and you're also providing censorship resistance for them as well, and also those intellectual protections. So proof of authorship and proof of origin of these pieces of art can now be tied back to the artists themselves. But it could be anonymous until the author or creator wants to come forward. So it's also protecting their identity as well, which is a very important use case for blockchain. So that's that. The next evolution, and it's not really an evolution, this is kind of what blockchain was hopefully meant to be the entire time, decentralized finance. It's conventional finance tools built on the blockchain. So derivatives markets, loans, you name it, stocks are just being built on a blockchain as opposed to being centralized in Wall Street and S&P 500, you name it. DeFi is kind of marked by an Ethereum aspect to it, but not all DeFi is necessarily Ethereum based. A project that I personally worked on with an amazing team was called the Digital Reserve. And the Digital Reserve was meant to be a micro-lending blockchain platform. And my role with the team was actually to design a credit scoring system and reputation system for borrowers and developing nations to actually build up a credit score to borrow money. And the one thing that we wanted to do was to ensure that external, if there were any external reputations or credit scores that existed pre this platform, didn't impact the way they were perceived or looked at within our ecosystem. So that meant that I went through a lot of academic literature about microlending and credit scoring in the development space before even trying to design an appropriate credit scoring model. Ultimately, I created a very basic one that was more of an expert system where it was mimicking the decision processes of traditional lenders without using their outside information in terms of how they felt about this particular person. And ultimately, we were going to use an unsupervised machine learning algorithm where it started to learn from our system itself and create its own credit scoring model, which hopefully would ignore some of our biases as people in the lending process. And yeah, so this is an opportunity for entrepreneurs to get involved, to develop these tools, but there are also investment opportunities as well, just like the stock market or getting involved in a peer-to-peer lending platform. These are legitimate opportunities for entrepreneurs and investors to kind of get their hands dirty in the blockchain space without going so deep into understanding like the protocol level technologies. And I'm using this in my class. There are a lot of decision trees on whether or not you need a blockchain. I think this is a useful tool for entrepreneurs and for academics to think through a blockchain. Maybe not this decision tree, but I particularly like this decision tree. It's pretty easy to understand. And if you just walk through it, you can see really quickly how you start to take yourself out of the running of using a blockchain. So I would encourage any entrepreneur who wants to get involved in some way and wants to build a project to look at a decision tree like this. Because in a lot of cases, blockchain still isn't necessary or may not be useful, even though it could be rewarding in a lot of situations. So I encourage anyone to take a look at this and make that ultimate decision. And in terms of tools to get started, if someone's interested purely in cryptocurrencies, I always encourage them, and this isn't me promoting a platform for my own purposes, it's a good learning tool. Coinbase provides the opportunity to earn money while learning about cryptocurrencies. So whether or not you use it to transact cryptocurrencies with your friends or not, use it to make some money. You can make up to $115 just taking some quizzes and learning some things about different cryptocurrencies. I think that's a fantastic tool. If you want to learn about building smart contracts without coding, and this is something that I will actually be doing essentially boot camps with students at William & Mary and alumni as well, I'll be using something called SymbaChain. SymbaChain is a visual programming language. So it's using business logic to recreate a smart contract that, again, if you're talking about the Dapp ecosystem, putting that smart contract in between your web pages up front and whichever blockchain or decentralized file system like IPFS or Ethereum that you want to use in the back. This is a great opportunity to play around with that and actually design it and understand what's going on. And the code being created in the background while you're using this visual tool. So the smart contract's being created. And when you're done, you can publish it, and it's on Ethereum. And you have created a smart contract. And you have a very, very basic user interface that you can use to engage with that smart contract. But you can also use more complex things if you have some UX background, or maybe you engage with some students at William & Mary that have UX and HTML and web page background to partner and create a Dapp. And if you want to learn about cryptocurrencies and think about cryptocurrencies like a trader, this is not me giving investment advice. I'm not encouraging or discouraging it. There are tools that look similar to Forex traders and stock traders on platforms like CoinMarketCap, where you can see daily changes, yearly changes, a lot of the traditional tools that's used for technical analysis and in day trading. You have access to those tools. And at some point, I do think that it would be appropriate to bring in experienced traders just to expose alumni and students to that as well. But again, that's no investment advice. Yeah, so that's what I have for you today.
Cool. Well, great. Thank you so much, Troy. That was awesome. Somebody who does not know, before the session, now I do, but did not know anything about blockchain. That was really informative, so thank you for that. I'd love to throw a few follow-up questions at you, if that's okay. Cool. All right, so one of the questions I had was, I love that you included the last slide with like tools on how to get started. You know, I think for me, and I think for a lot of people who maybe, you know, aren't as into STEM or data or stuff like that, blockchain can seem a little intimidating. And also maybe because it's intimidating, it might feel like, oh, like that little decision tree that you had, like, do I need blockchain for my project? Is this a skill that I need? So what's your kind of feeling on, you know, is this a skill that, you know, all people, all, you know, students graduating, going into the workforce should know, or it can be useful no matter where what you're going into?
Sure. Yeah. So I have a few thoughts on that. One, I would say everyone should know at least something about blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Whether or not if it's useful for them in their future in terms of potential developments, or whether or not their company wants to use blockchain or something like that, just being exposed. I mean, this is kind of the goal of a liberal arts education, right? Like being exposed to a bunch of different things, and I think is super important. For me, I believe that in a lot of cases, blockchain has presented us with an opportunity that is not necessarily the benefit of blockchain itself, but is a benefit of the conversation we've had surrounding blockchain. That this is the first time that I think that lay people and academics are wrestling with a similar concept and also trying to apply some aspect of this potentially game-changing technology to change the world. So you have people that have never been interested in international development or international relations or social impact saying, oh my gosh, we can use blockchain for micro lending, or we can use blockchain for, you know, improving the transparency of transactions going cross-border, or we can bank the unbanked in developing countries and even domestically, because there are a lot of people in the United States that don't have access to bank accounts. So I think the conversation surrounding it is very important. To the extent that I think that blockchain may actually be revolutionary or not, I'm, being a decade in, still not quite sure. But I'd like to think that it's pushing us in a direction where we're collaboratively thinking and working together. So that narrative piece of blockchain is very important to me, and it's something that we focus on at the William & Mary Blockchain Lab. We're also very much a left and right side of the brain. We're not just STEM, we're also policy and regulatory focused and social science focused. So me and Gabrielle Hibbert, for instance, she is now in the TA for the Fundamentals of Blockchain course. She was a blockchain researcher at the lab this summer. We wrote a paper about blockchain use in Indian country. In Indian country, meaning American Indian Alaska Natives, like the large pockets of community, both urban and rural, that the things that are impacting their life during coronavirus, they're really interesting potential blockchain use cases that are very boring to everyone, but could actually like solve some of these problems. This is a social phenomenon. This required us to reach out to experts in the field, in the health field, to a cultural anthropologist who is a friend of mine from the Baltimore American Indian Center and American Lifelines, where I worked for several years. My family, who had migrated from Canada and Virginia to the city, utilized some of those resources in these communities. So this was something near and dear to me. These are important things. So yeah, I think it's important for people to learn about it. They don't have to understand the deep text. That you can understand a high level surface like transparency, security, immutability. These are concepts that someone who's not in the STEM field can understand. And if you look at your field as a social scientist and say, where's transparency failing? So in like foreign aid, for instance, like what happens when aid gets to country XYZ in region ABC? Where does it go? Like we have a sense of uncertainty there. When it comes to that, like that's a transparency issue. This is something that we can think about from the social sciences as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, it so does. And it gets me going too, because I just love this stuff. Just going off of that, I also wonder, you know, when you're talking about, okay, like there are these systems with foreign aid and things like that, where clearly the people who need the resources are not getting them, it's not working. And so when you're looking to create a blockchain system, you know, how do you kind of integrate that into the life of people who are going to be receiving the resources that blockchain facilitates?
Yeah.
And so how do you do that? Like, what is that process? What's important to remember with that?
Was that a question?
Yeah, just like, yeah, no, I'm good. I'm just going off here. But like, I guess if I can refine a little bit, like, how does that process work? And what's kind of important to remember when you're using the technology and also keeping that social context in mind?
Sure, absolutely. So this isn't directly a Dapp per se, but we can look at a Dapp and use that as kind of a framework to think through this. So you have blockchain that's potentially very useful as a way of improving like the transparency of the aid process, for instance. What does that mean practically? The question that you're asking, or for an end user. Well, are people in Ghana or Southeast Asia or in a low-income community in the United States homogenous people?
Yeah.
The answer is no. How do they interact with technology? So it's important for you as a designer or a social scientist or even a tech person to think about that end user as well. So you're not just creating a blockchain solution, you're creating a human-centered interaction with these designs and with these tools that are actually useful. So like one of the processes is a usability study. So if you're creating a front end for that, or if you need to know who your stakeholders are, and you need to know how they interact with technology or with each other to design the best possible tool. The next stage is thinking through likely the politics of what happens with you're holding this data in essentially a decentralized manner, whether or not there are a few definitions that I ignored, like permissioned versus permissionless versus private in terms of blockchain. But when you're thinking through who has access to that data, or who wants to control the data, like you're running into politics there. So it's important to think about how those people that are a part of this foreign aid supply chain, as an example, interact with each other at the data level. Do they actually trust each other? And blockchain being touted as a trustless system, does it actually remove that need to trust each other as a tool? And of course, like it goes back to it, do you need blockchain? So looking at the decision tree. So like there's multiple layers that you're thinking about, like usability from the front end, engagement at the back end, and is the technology actually necessary to accomplish this? So definitely at every layer.
Yeah. So you're very thoughtful about it. It's so cool because I think a lot of times, like what you said, like what's great about William Mary and liberal arts education is that you're combining, all of these different. You're having the technology and the context and the technology to potentially change the context as well.
Yeah.
So that's super cool. I just wanted to wrap up by asking you, like on a more personal note, how did you kind of come to blockchain as something that you're interested in and something that you saw a lot of potential in?
Sure. So I was very eager when I first went to college. So I started college at 16. I first wanted to be an attorney, and then I wanted to be an anthropologist. And then I decided that my brain is more geared towards tech and STEM than it is towards the social sciences, but I found them very important. And I wanted to do something entrepreneurial that was a social impact business. And I landed on this idea called Dappless Community. And Dappless was my second company that was meant to help low-income community members get out of debt faster. So we were leveraging something similar to a Groupon, deep discount buying, along with like I guess you would say local first thought processes and more local currencies. So not actual legal tenure, but using something called strip money at the time to create a local buying pattern that actually incentivized people to keep the money within their community and help get out of debt faster with these deep discounts that would go towards paying off student loan debts, medical bills, things like that. The first iteration of this project was very, very clunky. A lot of the benefits, a lot of its failure had to do with a lack of the seamlessness between these multi-stakeholder transactions, and the fact that the script money was not necessarily digital yet. I was still leveraging local banks to like move this money from a local business to a bank. So I was building out a lot of partnerships on the ground. I was introduced to Bitcoin in about 2010, 2011, which was before I started this project, Dappless Community, and didn't necessarily immediately see how it engaged, but because I was so interested in alternative currencies, like I followed it for a while, to the point where I saw Ethereum. And when I saw this idea of smart contracts and these very complex transactions, I said, holy crap, like Dappless Community could continue going. But I was already up and running for about 3 years. We had generated revenue, but I realized that me alone was not cutting it. I needed to develop more of a, I guess you'd say, a technical background, like a strong computer science background. And I was running out of money, even though we were bringing in revenue. We definitely were on the negative end. And yeah, ever since the introduction to Ethereum and seeing how it applied to that social impact company, I followed blockchain ever since. And I've gone through the ups and downs of, oh, this is super useful, oh, this is a waste of time, it's too much hype, oh, this is really beneficial. And spent the 2 years in grad school at William and Mary writing papers with different faculty and peers on blockchain use cases, and that's kind of why we're here today.
It's a great story. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Troy. This was wonderful, and I can't wait to talk to you more, potentially on some more programming and hopefully in person sometime soon.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate your time.
All right, take care.
Good luck.